Somebody needs to hear this before you throw away another pill bottle out of guilt, because the idea that medication is a sign of spiritual failure has quietly destroyed more health than the sicknesses it was supposedly proving faith over. Most Christians in healing circles have absorbed an unspoken rule. Nobody ever states plainly from the pulpit, but everyone somehow understands anyway, that truly spiritual people do not need medicine, that reaching for a prescription is a quiet admission your faith was not strong enough to finish the job. That rule has never come from Scripture. It came from pride, dressed up as spirituality, and it has cost real people their lives while they waited for a miracle they were too embarrassed to pursue alongside wise medical care. Here is what nobody explains clearly enough about the finished work and the physical world it operates inside of. The cross settled a spiritual and legal reality about your body. It did not eliminate the natural world or suspend the physical means God has made available within it. Kenyon never taught believers to reject natural means as though using them proved a lack of faith. He taught believers to stand on the finished work while walking wisely through whatever natural circumstances they were in. And medicine is simply one form of natural wisdom, the same category as eating food when you are hungry or resting when you are exhausted. Nobody accuses a believer of lacking faith for eating breakfast, even though God could theoretically sustain their body without it. The same logic applies to medication. Yet somewhere along the way, this one specific category of natural means got singled out as spiritually suspicious in a way food, sleep, and exercise never were. Think about the strange inconsistency in how this gets applied. A believer who exercises regularly to strengthen their heart is called disciplined. A believer who eats carefully to manage their blood sugar is called wise. A believer who takes insulin to manage that exact same blood sugar is sometimes quietly viewed as spiritually weaker, as though the pill represents a different category of trust than the fork does. That distinction does not hold up under any honest examination. Both the fork and the pill are natural means operating in the physical realm. Neither one replaces your standing in the finished work, and neither one proves or disproves the strength of your faith. Consider what medicine actually is theologically rather than culturally. Every effective medication works because God built specific properties into the physical world, properties discovered by people studying His creation, whether or not those people ever acknowledged Him as a source. Antibiotics work because God designed certain compounds capable of disrupting bacterial processes. Insulin works because God designed the biochemistry it corrects. A surgeon's hands work because God designed the human body with the capacity to be repaired through skilled intervention. Medicine is not a competing power system running against God's authority. It operates entirely inside creation that already belongs to Him, using properties He placed there long before any pharmaceutical company existed to package them. If you are beginning to see that the shame you have carried around taking medication was never actually rooted in Scripture, hit that subscribe button, because what I am about to show you will free you from a guilt trip that has kept sincere believers sicker than they needed to be for years. And type in the comments, "I stand on the finished work while walking wisely through the natural world." Type that now, because holding both of those truths together is not contradiction. It is exactly how a spirit-filled believer is supposed to operate inside a physical body. You might say, but doesn't taking medicine show I do not really believe I am healed? That question assumes belief has to be demonstrated by refusing every available natural help, which is not how faith operated anywhere in Scripture. Jesus told a story about a man beaten and left on the road, and the hero of that story was the one who used natural means, oil, wine, bandages, and paid transportation to get the man proper care. Nobody in that parable is praised for standing over the wounded man declaring healing while refusing to bandage the wound. The Samaritan used every available natural resource while presumably still believing in God's care over the situation. That is the actual biblical pattern, using wisdom and natural means while trusting God, not choosing one instead of the other, as though they were competing options. There was a man named Gregory who had been taught for years that real faith meant refusing medication, that reaching for a prescription was essentially admitting defeat before the fight was even finished. He carried that belief through a health crisis that genuinely required intervention, delaying treatment for months while declaring healing scriptures over himself, watching his condition worsen the entire time, convinced that any day now his faith would finally be enough to turn things around without natural help. By the time he finally relented and sought proper medical treatment, his condition had progressed to the point where the treatment itself became far more difficult and invasive than it would have needed to be months earlier. Gregory later said the theology he had been taught did not protect his faith. It nearly cost him his life, and the guilt he carried about eventually accepting treatment delayed his recovery even further because he kept second-guessing whether seeking help meant he had failed spiritually. Right now, type this in the comments. Using wisdom is not the opposite of trusting God. Say it out loud, because that sentence undoes years of quiet shame that has kept believers suffering unnecessarily while waiting for permission they never actually needed. Consider what this looks like when it is lived out correctly rather than as an either-or choice. A believer receives a diagnosis requiring ongoing medication to manage. Most people in healing-focused churches feel an immediate internal conflict in that moment, wondering if taking the medication means giving up on believing for full healing. A believer who understands the relationship between the finished work and natural means responds differently. You take the medication as directed, using the natural wisdom available to manage your body responsibly, while simultaneously standing on what the finished work already declared about your body's ultimate condition. Those two things are not in tension. The medication addresses the natural realm in the present moment. Your confession addresses the spiritual reality that your body is aligning toward. You are not choosing between faith and wisdom. You are exercising both at the same time, the way any mature believer operating in two realms simultaneously is supposed to. A woman named Patricia had watched her own mother refuse necessary heart medication decades earlier under similar teaching, convinced that taking it would demonstrate weak faith, and her mother's health declined severely as a direct result of that refusal. When Patricia herself was diagnosed with a condition requiring daily medication years later, she made a conscious decision to break that pattern in her own family. She took her medication faithfully every single day, while also maintaining a consistent confession about her body's healing, refusing to let either practice cancel out the other. She told her own children clearly that using wisdom was not a failure of faith, that both things could be true simultaneously. and she watched her own health stabilize in a way her mother's never had. Not because her faith was stronger, but because she was no longer sabotaging her body's natural healing process by withholding available help out of unnecessary guilt. Most Christians also raise the objection that if you really believed, you would not need the medication at all, that true healing means eventually being free from every medical intervention. That may indeed happen for many people as their bodies align with what has already been settled spiritually. But making that the required proof of genuine faith puts pressure on people to either lie about their situation or endanger their lives trying to force a timeline God never promised. Healing is not always instantaneous, and Scripture records plenty of gradual healings alongside the instant ones. A person using medication while their body gradually aligns with their confession over months or years is not failing. They are walking wisely through a process, exactly the way Naaman had to dip in the Jordan River 7 times, rather than experiencing instant healing on the first attempt, following the natural instructions given to him rather than assuming faith meant skipping the process entirely. Picture the specific moment doubt attacks a believer who is already on medication, whispering that their healing does not really count if it required medical help, that they should feel embarrassed rather than grateful for the tools available to them. That whisper is not humility. It is designed to make you feel disqualified from a testimony you actually have every right to celebrate. God working through a doctor's skill, through a medication's properties, through a surgeon's steady hands, is still God working. The finished work does not require you to reject every means he has provided in order to prove you trust him. That entire framing assumes God and medicine are somehow in competition, when medicine only exists because God built the physical properties that make it work in the first place. Consider the financial and emotional weight this teaching lifts once a believer actually understands it correctly. Families who have felt genuine shame around insurance copays, around prescription costs, around the simple act of picking up medication at a pharmacy can release that shame entirely once they understand the difference between using natural wisdom and lacking spiritual faith. A parent no longer has to feel like they are failing their sick child spiritually every time they administer a prescribed treatment. A believer managing a chronic condition no longer has to perform false victory in front of their church community while secretly feeling like a spiritual failure every time they open their medicine cabinet. That relief alone, apart from any physical healing, represents a significant deliverance from a burden that Scripture never actually placed on believers to begin with. There is also a practical wisdom dimension worth addressing directly, because standing on the finished work does not mean abandoning discernment about your natural choices. Wisdom still matters in how you use medical care, seeking good counsel, asking good questions, not blindly accepting every treatment without understanding it. The same way wisdom matters in every other natural decision a believer makes. Standing on healing does not mean suspending your judgment about doctors or treatments. It means holding your spiritual confession steady while exercising exactly the same discernment you would use in any other area of natural decision-making, neither treating medicine as a spiritual failure nor treating it as some kind of magic, replacing the need for genuine faith. Some will still push and ask what the actual difference is between someone who takes medicine while believing and someone who simply relies entirely on medicine without any spiritual confession at all. The difference is not visible from the outside in terms of what is physically happening in either person's treatment plan. The difference is entirely in what is happening internally, in what each person actually believes about their body's ultimate condition and future. One person is using natural means as the entirety of their hope, with no spiritual foundation underneath it. The other is using natural means wisely, while their deeper confidence rests in what the finished work already declared. Both may be taking the exact same medication, only one of them is operating with the fuller picture of what is actually available to them. Think about how this plays out inside a marriage, where one spouse holds the rigid version of this teaching and the other is the one actually managing a chronic condition. The spouse without the condition often becomes the loudest voice pushing against medication, not out of cruelty, but out of a sincere, misapplied belief that supporting the medication somehow means giving up on believing for full healing. That pressure adds an entirely unnecessary layer of conflict onto an already difficult health situation, forcing the sick spouse to either hide their treatment, feel judged for continuing it, or defend a decision that should never have required defending in the first place. A marriage that understands the difference between natural wisdom and spiritual confession removes that entire layer of conflict. Both spouses can agree the medication is simply wisdom being exercised, while the household's spoken confession continues declaring what the finished work already settled, and nobody has to hide a pill bottle out of fear it will be interpreted as spiritual failure. Consider the specific case of mental health medication, which tends to carry an even heavier layer of stigma inside healing-focused churches than physical conditions do. A believer managing anxiety or depression with prescribed medication often faces an unspoken suggestion that their struggle is purely spiritual, that sufficient faith or sufficient confession should make the medication unnecessary, that continuing to take it signals unresolved unbelief somewhere in their walk with God. That suggestion causes real harm because it frequently convinces people to discontinue medication that was genuinely stabilizing them, based on shame rather than any actual scriptural mandate. The chemistry of the brain is still part of the natural, physical realm God designed, no different in category from the chemistry of the pancreas or the heart. A medication correcting a chemical imbalance in the brain is operating in exactly the same category as a medication correcting one in the bloodstream, and singling out mental health treatment for extra suspicion reflects cultural stigma far more than it reflects sound theology. A pastor named Wallace had spent years quietly discouraging medication use from the pulpit, always with good intentions, always genuinely wanting his congregation to walk in full healing. It was not until a close friend nearly died from discontinuing essential medication after hearing one of Wallace's sermons that he was forced to re-examine what he had actually been teaching. He realized he had never once found a verse commanding believers to refuse available medical treatment as proof of faith. He had absorbed an assumption from other teachers and passed it along without ever tracing it back to actual scripture. Once he corrected the teaching publicly, several people in his congregation approached him afterward, relieved almost to tears, admitting they had been secretly continuing medication while pretending in public that they had been fully healed without it, terrified of the judgment they would face if anyone knew the truth. That kind of secrecy and shame inside a church community is not a sign of strong faith culture. It is a sign that fear has replaced grace as the operating principle around health. There is also a longer view worth considering: the way this teaching shapes an entire lifetime rather than just a single health crisis. A believer who spends decades believing medication represents spiritual failure will likely make increasingly risky decisions about their health as they age, delaying necessary treatment, minimizing symptoms to avoid the internal conflict, quietly suffering rather than seeking help early when problems are most treatable. A believer who understands from the beginning that natural wisdom and spiritual confession work together rather than against each other will seek help earlier, address problems sooner, and generally experience better outcomes precisely because they were never fighting an internal battle between faith and wisdom in the first place. Over a full lifetime, that difference in approach compounds significantly, and it is one more reason this specific misunderstanding deserves to be corrected clearly rather than left as an unspoken assumption passed down from one generation of believers to the next. Some will ask where the line sits, whether this means a believer should simply do whatever a doctor recommends without any spiritual discernment at all. That is not the balance being described here either. Wisdom means engaging your own judgment, praying about significant decisions, seeking a second opinion when something feels wrong, and staying an active participant in your own care rather than passively outsourcing every decision without thought. The point is not that medicine automatically overrides discernment. The point is that using medicine wisely, prayerfully, and thoughtfully is not evidence of spiritual failure, and refusing it out of fear-driven guilt is not evidence of spiritual strength. Both extremes, blind refusal and blind compliance, skip the actual work of walking wisely through a real decision with real stakes. Right now, type this in the comments one more time if it applies to you. My medicine and my confession are not enemies. Let that settle in as the closing thought before we move forward, because so much unnecessary suffering has come from believers thinking they had to pick a side in a battle that was never actually happening in Scripture to begin with. Stop feeling guilty for using the wisdom God made available to you inside a physical world He designed with medicine as one of its natural provisions. Stop treating your prescription bottle as evidence against your faith instead of one more tool in a life that is standing on something far deeper than any single treatment could ever provide alone. Take what you need, use the wisdom in front of you, and keep declaring what the finished work already settled about your body while you do it, because those two things were never actually in competition to begin with. Live like it.